At 28 years old, I was shot and paralyzed from the chest down. I had two options. I could stop and let the things I cannot control me, or I could move forward and put my energy into things that would improve my life and those around me. I chose to move forward and surround myself with risk takers, innovators, and leaders who've chosen the same path. Join us on the journey. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Forward with me, Herrera, and my guest today, Elliot Ackerman. Elliot is a former Marine officer. He served as a Marine raider before transitioning to the CIA, and then left and did something totally unrelated and became an award-winning author where he's authored multiple books, including one of my favorite new ones, which is hot off the press, called 2034, that you can find anywhere books are sold. We talk about his days in the Marine Corps and the founding days of the Marine Special Operations Command, or MARSOC, Marine Raider community, what it was like to transition to the highly specialized units he was in within the CIA, or as he called it, the big leagues, or the NFL, and then why he decided to leave that position and pursue something totally unrelated and try to be successful as an author, which he has done and achieved significant accolades doing. So truly had an amazing conversation with Elliot. Hope you enjoy this episode of Forward. If you do, and you're watching this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. If you're watching it on Spotify or listening on Spotify, please share with anyone you think may be interested. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. Give us a 5-star rating if you so care to, as we're hoping to attract more and more people to this movement and the tribe, and more people who can benefit from the messages that we're sharing and learn from these experiences. So hope you enjoy this episode of Forward with me, Herrera, and Elliot Ackerman, and hope y'all have a great week. This is the first time we've actually met and had a chance to converse. And so when I was doing some research before this episode, I was really interested in your background and thought I'd start off just by asking you what drove your decision to join the military after you graduated from college.
Oh, yeah. Well, I did ROTC in college. So my decision was like before going into college. And just to give a little bit of context, that was, I guess, in 1998. So it was pre 9/11. But I say there were kind of like really three things that contributed to that decision. So the first was I grew up overseas, or spent a significant time of my childhood overseas. Nowhere too exotic when I was in England. But I think just like viewing the U.S. from even like kind of a little bit removed gave me just an appreciation of the country and made me feel like I wanted to give back in some way. So I think I also wanted, when I got out of college, to have a job where whether I was good at my job or bad at my job really mattered. So I wanted a lot of responsibility. I couldn't think of anywhere else aside from the military where, or specifically the Marine Corps, where they put you in charge of like 46 people when you're 22 years old. So that appealed to me. And I'd say like kind of the last thing was, like I was that kid who never stopped playing with his GI Joes. So like I had this inherent fascination with the military. So like you combine those three variables, it led me into the Marine Corps. And then obviously I made that decision that I wanted to serve before 9/11, and then 9/11 happened while I was in college. And then I came into a peacetime military and graduated school and went on active duty into a wartime military.
Yeah. Did you have any other family members in the military, or was it just something you were exposed to through GI Joe and everything else?
Yeah, a little bit. My grandfather was in the Navy in World War II. He worked in research, like developing radar. My father was in the New Jersey National Guard during Vietnam as a typist clerk. So he kind of jokes about his military experience. He made it to corporal, but got busted back down to private because he got caught sneaking off base one night to go see a movie. So there were people in my family who served, but I think I'm probably the one who, took it a little bit further.
Nice. That's awesome. I can relate to the sneaking off base thing. So I actually almost got kicked out of the Naval Academy when I was a plebe.
Oh, yeah.
I was terrible because I was going home to Delaware, and they had a 22-mile liberty limit.
Mm-hmm.
And Delaware was like 50 miles, right? And so on Saturday, I'd just like get out of there, go home, come back before, because you're only allowed out from like 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. on Saturdays. And so I did that. But one time I was out with wife, who was my girlfriend and fiance at the time, since we were dating in high school, and like some guy who I think one of my teachers who I rubbed the wrong way in high school, like saw me and found out that I get in trouble, and so he like sent this nasty email to the Naval Academy, and then and then I got in trouble, so I got busted down.
Yeah, that's pretty messed up that you sent that email.
It was bad, I probably deserved it. I was doing the wrong thing. I learned a lot from it, so I needed some humility at that time too. So like, I was a little wild. Obviously, had a disdain for authority, which didn't bode well at the Naval Academy. But I learned, so
Yeah.
that's awesome. I can relate to that. And so when you went in the Marine Corps, so you've self-selected to go in the Marine Corps, but then you've also self-selected. You ended up in the infantry as well. What was the line of reasoning you had for that?
I don't know. I bet it's probably similar. You're an infantry officer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably similar to you. Like the Marine Corps. Listen, the organizational soul of the Marine Corps has been and always will be the infantry. So, so I knew I wanted to be a Marine, and to me, being a Marine, like really being a Marine, meant that you were going to be an infantry officer. So it seemed very natural to me to want to have that experience. Sort of why I wanted the Marine Corps in the first place. And I think that and again, it goes back to the desire to want to feel like if you're good at your job or you're bad at your job, it matters. So the leadership dynamic appealed to me. Being in the infantry and the Marine Corps, as you know, is like a very unique experience. I mean, you get to serve in units. They're like very storied units with very strong organizational identities. I think what was sort of interesting for me was I really felt like I got to have the experience of being a rifle platoon commander, like in the most intense way, because I showed up to my infantry unit in April of 2004. In June, we went to Iraq, and sort of dropped right into that. And then in November, we fought in the Second Fallujah battle, which was it was really like being a Marine platoon commander on steroids. So, I remember I had my company executive officer at the time, would laugh with us, and he'd say like, you guys don't even have your range control cards yet, but you're shooting rockets at like targets 50 meters away and launching mortars and doing all this stuff. I had a company commander who, sort of, he said this, is very apocryphal that he said this, but he said, listen, he brought me and another buddy of mine, who's actually he's my other buddy, his name's Doug Barnes. He's the battalion commander for 2-8. So he stayed in. And he pulled the two of us aside towards the end of that battle, and he said, you guys are both the luckiest and the unluckiest platoon commanders I've ever met. He said, you're the luckiest because right out of the gate, you've gotten to do this. And he said, you're the unluckiest because nothing you ever do in the Marine Corps is going to compare with this. And, and I think you wound up being true in many ways. I had other great experiences in the Marine Corps, like serving, in second Raider battalion, but there was something very unique for me about my platoon commander time.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I had a phenomenal experience, and it's special, right? It's hard to replicate, and I don't know that it's replicated in other services or even in other branches, with other units within the Marine Corps. Being in an infantry platoon, being in charge of an infantry platoon is
special.
Amazing. Yeah, it's a very special thing. And just to set the stage too for some of the viewers, you kind of glossed over this, but to highlight, like you're talking about the legendary aspect of the operations in the unit that you were a part of. You were part of 1-8, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and when you went into Fallujah, this was one of the most chaotic and intense combat operations I think that the U.S. military had seen probably since Vietnam, right? I mean, it was incredibly intense and combative.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look back at the trajectory of the Iraq War. As time's gone on, I realized that it was an outlier experience. So, most of the Iraq War was not that type of conventional kind of high intensity combat. It was, patrols, IEDs, and that was actually very much my experience before the Fallujah battle. Like the Fallujah battle was sort of this like pause in time. And then we went in for more than a month, fought this sort of set piece battle, and then it was over, and we went back to kind of the much grittier and grim work of counterinsurgency. So it was really this this outlier experience. And you know, it's often like been said, like that the when you talk of the services that the Army has its tanks, the Navy has its ships, the Air Force has its planes, and the Marine Corps has its culture. And the culture is like very powerful in a Marine, infantry battalion, line company, or rifle platoon. And I really had the chance to see how that culture like cohered. And the guys who were in that platoon, like we're all still very close to this day. I mean, it's what I guess more than 15 years ago, but we're all still in really
Yeah.
good touch.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, and so when I was reading through your citation as well, you were injured and were awarded the Purple Heart. Did you get evacuated, or did you stay in country, or how did that work
No,
out
I
for you?
was I was returned to duty. I mean, listen, a lot of guys got a lot worse than what I got. I just ate a little bit of a grenade, and the corpsman patched me up, and and I was all right. So I was returned to duty. But
Yeah.
yeah, you know, it was interesting. My time in the two sort of units I was with is my Marine Rifle Platoon, and then my team in the Raiders, and those were both like very unique and like very special experiences, and similar in certain ways, but also like very very different as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned that. And so you did that deployment. Did you do another infantry deployment before transitioning to the Raiders, or what was your career like after
Yeah,
that?
I did. So we came back from that deployment in it was like early February 2005,
Okay.
and then we were going to do a Marine Expeditionary, on a MEU. So we were going out with the MEU, and then we were all going to schools, and I was at Infantry Mortar Leaders Course, so I became the 81's platoon commander.
Nice.
And then Hurricane Katrina hit, and we were on ACM, so Air Contingency MAGTAF, so which is like you're on like 24 hours notice to go anywhere in the world. And it was Labor Day weekend, and we were going to have a 96, so like a 4-day pass. I remember the hurricane had just hit, and there was lots of rumors that we were going to get called down to go to the hurricane. Our battalion commander has a battalion formation, says basically, you all might have heard the rumors that we're going to go down to Katrina. I just talked to the commanding general. The rumors are not true. Enjoy your 96. And we shotgunned out the entire battalion. And literally 2 hours later, we got called, not so fast. You're going down to Katrina. So we spent more than a month down in New Orleans doing relief work. Then we came back from that, and then we deployed out with the MEU. And then when Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, we were out with the MEU, and so we wound up evacuating the embassy in Beirut, which for our battalion was sort of interesting because 1-8 was famously in 1983 the infantry battalion that was at the barracks in Beirut when the barracks was bombed. Um, and so we went back and re-evacuated the embassy. So then I came back for that MEU deployment, and then I went to Second Raider Battalion as a team
Yeah.
leader. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it brought back a memory of mine too. So I had similar experience. I got my second deployment. Went to Iraq in 2008, came back, and then was going on the 24th MEU.
It's the same
And
year I was on.
oh yeah, yeah. It's the same situation in 2010 with Haiti. So they had an earthquake there, and they're like, "Oh, we're not going to go," and then you're going to go, and then you know, uh, get messed with a little bit, right? Like okay, my company commander left, and I was the XO of the company, so we got an email that said, "Hey, get 150 guys ready to go on helicopters. You're going to fly into this place and help reestablish security in Port-au-Prince."
Yeah.
They're like, "You'll be there for 24 hours, right?" And we're like, "Okay, cool." So we pack pretty light, right? 24 hours, and then as we're like getting on a helicopter, they're like, "Oh, it might be like 48 to 72." We're like, "Okay, got it." Like, see how we can survive. And then literally when we land, they're like, "We don't know when we're getting you. We don't know how to resupply you. Like,
Yeah.
figure it out, So, and then that was like 10 days later before we got out, right? And so we ended up finding some Army guys that hooked us up and scrounged, different stuff through there. But it's
Yeah.
funny. It's
That's
interesting
the thing with the
times.
Marine Corps. It never changes. It's always the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same tactics. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And so at that time, what year was it when you went to Second Raider Battalion?
So I showed up there. It would have been like January 2007. So like just a few months after they formed,
Gotcha.
and that was a very interesting time to be there. They the Raiders kind of came together. In some ways, there's parallels to like sort of how the SEALs were formed, in so much as the original SEALs were all the UDT guys. And so when I was there, the original Raiders, in this newest carnation, were all the Force Recon guys. So it was basically just like Second Force Reconnaissance Company had become, and it wasn't called Second Raider Battalion, it was Second Marine Special Operations Battalion back then, Second MSOB. It's a horrible name. They were still being very stingy about calling us Raiders back then. And so all the guys there, we were sort of grandfathered in. And I had in college, I'd worked this crack deal one summer in college to go to. I'd worked deals to go to jump school, dive school, and the amphibious reconnaissance school in college. That's a whole other story. But I got sort of really lucky and had a great Marine officer instructor, this captain who he was a pilot, but he thought I was hysterical. He's like, "Yo, I'll cut you no cost orders to any school you want to go to," meaning like the unit wouldn't fund it, but he would just give me the paper orders that I needed. He's like, "And if you can talk your way into the school, I'll work it out so you can go. I don't care, you can go." So I actually wound up. It's a little bit of digression, but between my towards my senior year, I wound up talking my way into the amphibious reconnaissance school. Basically, there was a captain at Holy Cross College who'd been at Second Force, and he was like, "Oh yeah, you should go to ARS, and I know the XO down there." And the XO is this guy named Doug Zembeck. I don't know if you know Doug.
Everybody knows him, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I
exactly.
never had the fortune to meet him. He's a legend, right?
Yeah, he's a legend. So, I mean, at the time he wasn't a legend. He was Doug Zembeck. I mean, he was still a little bit of a legend, but really, colorful guy. And so Doug basically said, "Yeah, if this, midshipman wants to come down here, like, usually like we wash out, a third of the class in the first 48 hours. So as long as we do that, there's going to be room for him if he can still stick it out." And so he let me come down. That's when I first met Doug Zembeck, and then
Wow.
I'm one of many people who was blessed to have him as a mentor before he was killed. And but anyway, so I show up. So fast forward many years now, and I kind of show up, and I was going to go to Second Force Recon, but then Second Force Recon became Second MSOB, and now I'm at Second MSOB. And I originally came on board because I'd been through all the schools. Back in the day, originally the unit was organized, so now you have the Marine Special Operations teams. There were no teams back then. You had these big companies, and you had two platoons. You had a trailer platoon and a direct action special reconnaissance platoon. And the first two companies that went out deployed that way, and it kind of didn't work because what the Special Operations Command in Afghanistan wanted was they wanted these teams, like ODAs, like the Special Forces teams. So they said, "All right, we're going to get rid of this trailer platoon, and we're just going to take our big direct action special reconnaissance platoon, and we're just going to chop it into thirds." And so within like 3 or 4 months of being there, they said, "All right, you're not going to be the trailer platoon commander now. You're going to have one of these teams." And there were three. I was a first lieutenant still, and there was like I was about to become a captain. And it's like, "You got a team, Ackerman," and there were two other guys who were senior to me who had teams. And I remember literally being in Alpha 66. I don't know if you know that building, but that was like the one of the kind of the buildings at Camp Lejeune. And sitting there, because we were the first company to go out as MSOTs, which are still like the unit of, the coin of the realm in Marine Special Operations.
Yeah.
And literally, like, no one had given us any guidance as to what the core mission was of an MSOT. So I remember being in Alpha 66 in like April of 2007, and at the time we didn't have a major in charge of our company, so it was the senior captain who was also like my surfing buddy, and he wrote one of my fitness reports. And the three of us, like, I'm about to be a captain, two older captains, like, "All right, well, what is the Marine Special Operations team? Kind of like, what's our core mission?" And like writing it on a whiteboard. And when I later deployed, I deployed with lots of Special Forces guys, and the SF guys, they taught us like, "Man, like, it's crazy you guys are building this, and it's also, it's Marine Special Operations, it's new, like, it must be pretty exciting, it's probably like being a Green Beret, like back in the 1950s. You'd be like, "Yeah, like it's cool because like you feel like you're the first ones doing it, but it's like also like there are lots of growing pains." I remember like the first time we went on relaxed grooming standards in Afghanistan, and the Siege of Soda, the Special Operations Command, which is run by the Army guys, like, "Yeah, all of our Special Forces team grow beards. You Marines grow beards." And like people back in Camp Lejeune had like a minor freak out when they saw the photos of all of us. I mean, it sounds silly now, but like I will tell you, Derek, I spent on that one deployment in Afghanistan, I spent more time talking about our beards than any other single operational issue.
Doesn't surprise me
Yeah,
one bit. We've learned some things, I think, but we still haven't learned a lot of things. So
yeah,
come a long way. I think tactically, right? Like we figured it out pretty fast, right? I think well, we've come a long way, but even now, right? Operational grooming standards, we're still figuring it out. And uniforms, yeah,
yeah.
we're still getting there. New kids on the block, right? So
Right.
we'll get it there. But that's awesome. Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, so when you guys deployed to Afghanistan, were you before the company that had gotten sent back?
So I was with Fox. Fox Company was the company that got sent back, and actually their Dasser platoon commander was in 1-8 with me. He was a great guy. He was a first lieutenant when I was a second lieutenant, and he was in Fallujah. He was shot by a sniper through his femur, went home, rehabbed his leg, and then went through amphibious reconnaissance school like 9 months later and passed with, basically having been shot through his femur 9 months before. And then he was the first Dasser platoon commander. So they got in, they had problems. I look back at it, I think, the siege of Sodif didn't know what to do with them. And, it's this growing pains because I know those Marines. Like, those were great Marines in that first company. Um, and then there was a company after them, Gulf Company went out, and then we were hotels. So we were the third.
Gotcha.
Um, and our team, our mission was we were the first team paired with the Afghan commandos, which I think
Oh, nice.
became like an enduring mission from our
Yeah.
side. But so we were the first ones to do it, and we moved them from. We met them, the 207th Commandos. We met them out in Kabul, and we flew them out. We finished their training with them, and we flew them out west to Shindan Airfield and set them up
Mhm.
there. And it was our team, an Army Special Forces team, were the two advisor teams with this commando battalion. And sort of tacit in our mission was not only train the commandos, train the commandos. You are in charge of capture kill operations for Regional Command West against senior level Taliban, but it was also, and oh, by the way, figure out how to get along really well with this Army ODA because, like, so far, Marine Army relations and special operations in Afghanistan has not been going well. And, like, to the Marines' credit and, like, and to the SF guys' credit, like, our teams were very tight, really tight over that deployment. We're all, like, still in touch. It was an awesome ODA we worked with, and, like, the Marines in
Oh,
our
cool.
team were great with them. And so,
Nice.
yeah, we had a very, I think, like a really positive deployment, and got to do some really, really cool out of the box stuff. Like as a Marine, it was fantastic. Like our nearest adjacent unit was like 70 kilometers away from us, so we had a lot of autonomy, a lot of independence, and as you know, like the Marines in MARSOC are some pretty dynamic group of guys. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think by the time I had gotten to training, I got to training a few years after the timeline you're talking about, and so a lot of our guys, a lot of our instructors were Fox company guys and second MSOB guys and everything as we were going through ITC. So got to hear some of those stories but you know talk about it and telling stories and these guys were heavy hitters, right? Very professional, very capable, competent type of people you want to be on a team with. So that's impressive. And so I'm still just like taking a step back, like thinking to what you said before, which is you were a midshipman who'd been through amphibious reconnaissance school, jump school, dive school, get to your unit, get to the second, Raider Battalion early, and you're a first lieutenant in Afghanistan with, these guys out running around doing the first commando mission. So that's like, it's impressive. It's pretty amazing to hear that.
Well, I have perspective now, and I'm like very grateful. I mean, just like the timing worked and like the beat.
Yeah.
I'm grateful and I'm proud now that I can like say like, wow, I was there right at the beginning. But but I still remember what it felt like, and at the time it felt like, oh my god, like no one knows what we're doing. Like this doesn't, it really felt like a pickup game. And the Marines were like, you know, did an amazing job. I mean, I'll tell you one anecdote. I remember, I don't know, probably about a month and a half into that deployment, we had to go split team at the beginning of the deployment. So half the team with my team sergeant stayed in Shindan to get things set up for the commandos because we knew we were bringing these 700 commandos out west. The other half of the team with me went to this place called Rizhkfor outside of Kabul, which was their training center. To, like meet up with them, do like the last 2 or 3 weeks of their training, and then fly them all out west. So we get everybody out west. We get set up, and one of the element leaders in my team, um, he's still a reservist, but his name everyone called him Squirrel. Skwrl, the Squirrel, because like Squirrel could get anything for you. And Squirrel was a DLI trained Arabic speaker. He taught himself how to speak Dari like within 4 months. And so we get back to Shindan, and we're on the base, and Squirrel grabs me one day. And he's like, "Hey man, like listen, so I've got some good news and I got some bad news." And I'm like, "Okay, what's the good news?" He's like, "Well, the good news is I've gone to like all of our Afghan contractors, the ones who are like contracting our food with, our fuel with, our construction with, our guard force, and like the last few teams who've been here, and the teams who preceded us were Special Forces National Guard teams." He's like, they've been getting ripped off, so the good news is I figured this out. They've been getting charged way too much, and I've renegotiated all of our contracts. So we're going to pay about like a tenth of what we used to pay. I'm like, well, what's the bad news? And Squirrel was also our pay agent, so he would draw our money out of Kabul and everything. And so he's like, well, the bad news is, I got to fly back to Kabul now, and I got to tell them that we've been getting ripped off, which means all the other teams are going to have to figure out how to renegotiate their contracts, and I don't know what they're going to do. It's going to be a huge mess. I'm like, okay, well, like, what do you got for me? And he's like, well, there's one or two things we can do. I can either do that and fly back to Kabul, or we can just keep drawing the same amount of money we've been drawing. I'll pay these guys the going rate, and we can keep the rest, and we can just use it for projects around the base, and like we don't need to get approval from anybody. And so I'm like, all right, so as long as there's no hanky panky like that, let's do that. So we had all these like great we lived on an old Soviet base, and they had an Olympic sized swimming pool on the base. We like turned it into like a reservoir to irrigate all the villagers' fields. Like we rebuilt guard towers. We were doing all this stuff. And so, and I remember at one point, I was like a supply flight had landed, and it was me, Squirrel, and the other guy who managed a lot of our labor force was a guy named Aaron Torian. I don't know if you know T. He was killed in 2014, yeah. And T. And so we're sitting there, and we're like wearing our shalwar kameez that like we'd all started rocking around the fireplace. We got our huge beards, and the mail flight had came in one night, and my grandparents had sent me like a Harry and David, like the sausage things with the crackers and the cheese. And I'm like, oh, what am I going to do with this? And I go, and Squirrel would have boxed wine shipped into him from, he had a girlfriend who would send him boxed wine. So I go by Squirrel's room, and I knock on the door. I'm like, hey, Squirrel, like my grandparents got me this wine and cheese. And Squirrel's in there with his boxed wine. He's like, oh, we'll have like a wine and cheese party. And T's in the room. And we got our guns, and we're all decked out. And Squirrel's got his locker. And in his locker is probably like $500,000 worth of, Afghanis that he's using to pay people out. And I just remember this moment. We're having our like little modest wine and cheese parties with all the cash and the guns. And I remember looking at T and Squirrel and be like, you know what, guys, I'm going to go out on a limb right now. And I'm going to say we're probably like the 3 farthest out Marines in the entire Corps at this very moment. And I just only bring that up because, like, I can talk to you about like Fallujah and stuff like that, and those and those memories for me are very like sharp and clear, but also just like doing stuff like that, like really entrepreneurial stuff in Marsoc with just like Aaron Torian's a legend. He's a phenomenal Marine, and Squirrel and those guys. I mean, it's just as valuable to me.
Yeah, and some of those memories, it's like seemingly insignificant or not as eventful at the time, right? But then you look back on it and you're like, yeah, that was really awesome. Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah. It takes a little context to really appreciate. I mean, at that moment, I think I did appreciate. I was trying to like take a step back, like, God, we should remember this because this is pretty.
Yeah.
When we're all like clean shaven back in Camp Lejeune in 5 or 6 months, like we're not even going to remember that we were out here, but it's important to like remember this.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I never had the opportunity to meet Master Torian, but heard about him afterwards and got to know him through the community, and obviously it was legendary. And was sorry to hear that he was killed in action, but that was impressive. And you guys laid a foundation that was very successful. And so at least the way that I recall it, and I don't know if you have any insight on this, but hearing the people that hearing our instructors at ITC kind of talking about the turmoil that they'd been through with the mission they'd been on, and then getting sent home. This was an experiment, right? This was a startup. MARSOC was a startup at that time, where up until 2006, we didn't have a component within the Special Operations Command. And so we had Recon and Force Recon, which were specialized units, but they were not part of the Special Operations Command. And so it wasn't until 2006 when Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld signed that order to create MARSOC that happened. But like you said, we didn't know what we were doing, right? Like, overnight, you just get thrust into this entirely new environment with a different culture and a joint atmosphere, and figuring it out. And then the incident that had happened, I wasn't there and I don't know the details, but basically the guys had gotten into an engagement. Some people had said that it wasn't pursuant to the ROE or authorized some aspect, and so they got the book thrown at them, right, and sent home from country and all these sorts of things, and so that led a lot of people, I think, to question the value that the Marine Corps brought to SOCOM and if it was a mistake and everything else. And so the units that went back immediately after from both 1st and 2nd Raider Battalion laid a foundation for success right through 2007, 2008, 2009, and so on. And to the point where, like, all the stuff you're talking about, I can like intuitively understand of not knowing what's going on and trying to figure it out at that point. But it was amazing because by the time I'd shown up for training in 2011, we had all of that knowledge, right? By the time I got to a team, it was very clear, exactly how we needed to operate within this environment. And, we were pulling best practices and learning very quickly, which I think was a testament to the culture that, men like you and those that you served with had laid the foundation that we fell in on, right? Which was figure it out real fast, right? And become a great asset, make yourself an asset and not a liability, and figure it out and become a quick learner. And so it's really interesting, and it's interesting to hear you say that because from what I hear, there was more than a few conversations of like, send the Marines back to the Marine Corps, right? Like we don't want them anymore, and the Marine Corps didn't want us to go either. They didn't want to lose people. They thought they were losing their best talent. So it was this really interesting.
I think that's a really good point. The Marine Corps didn't. You were sort of stuck between not everyone, but just there were definitely people in SOCOM who didn't want this to happen. Well, why do we want these Marines? We don't want 2,600 Marines. We want 2,600 more seats for Special Forces soldiers or SEALs or what have you. And then you had a Marine Corps that was very skeptical about this. I mean, again, it's like, a very poignant moment for me was when they finally called us Raiders. Like, we were second MSOB. Like, it was just such a horrible, like, who are you guys? Well, we're second MSOB. What's an MSOB? Like, it's, it sounds like a medical condition. Like, I don't want an MSOB. Like, and, we're Marines, but we're the special operation, like, listen, every other group in U.S. SOCOM, you have the SEALs, you've got the Rangers, so when General Amos finally said, and I think it's interesting that it was General Amos who did it because he was an aviator. I think it kind of took an aviator to say, like, no, this is what it should be. Infantry guys who kind of intuitively don't like this. So I think it took General Amos to do it. I know he was a controversial commandant in other ways, but I think he really got this right. Say you guys are going to be the Raiders, and and that legacy should live on, and it should live on in all of you. Listen, I'd be lying. I felt enormous pride. I felt like, the Squirrels and the Torians and all the folks I'd been there with had, like, over several years at that point in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and other places had earned that. So I felt like we really were able to kind of earn that at the end of the day. So yeah, I'd actually tell you that's one of the more proud moments of my life when I heard that. I was actually out of youth when that happened, but I was immensely proud.
Yeah, I was there. I saw the campaigning and stuff going on. So that was right before I had medically retired in 2014, and actually, to your point, Amos signed it, right? But I don't think he wanted to. I think it was McRaven actually who pushed it. So Admiral McRaven, one of the last flag officer visits we had before I got out was briefing him at 1st Raider Battalion, and at the end, that was one of his talking points, right? Was like, hey, this makes sense. We need to do this. we need to way to establish bona fides within SOCOM to know that you have a badge, you don't have a badge, right? Like I can't tell who's a raider, who's not, right? And you don't have a name, you don't have a brand, you don't have any of this stuff, right? And so I he was one of the driving forces for sure behind that, and it was really interesting to see, how that kind of came together. But it was really cool too because I think the other driving force, which we've seen, is the Raider Association, the Marine Raider Association, which had all the surviving members of the World War II Marine Raiders who were looking to pass on that legacy and all of that. And unfortunately, those guys are getting very old. There's not many of them left, but that was one thing that they were very staunchly in favor of, was trying to get their legacy cemented. Which was interesting. And going back to what you were saying about the Marine Corps, people not wanting to do it, I remember that was one of my first events once I had transferred to MARSOC was we had the commanding general coming out and just crushing guys, right? Like he just pulled us all aside in the room and just crushed us. And he said, "You're not special. You got one title and it's on your uniform right here. That's all. That's it. You're a Marine." He's like, "You're not Raiders. You're not special. You're not special operators. You're a Marine," right? I'm like, man, like I didn't know generals hated their own people, so like this is like.
Well, the two are not mutually exclusive. Like my experience working very closely with with special forces was like all of our guys knew, that we were different than they were, and we had a different culture. Like it wasn't glaringly obvious, but like you could tell the difference. Like a staff. I'm not saying this to poo-poo the SF guys because like they're great, but like a staff sergeant in an MSOT is very different than a staff sergeant in an ODA. Like there's a depth of experience that Marine staff sergeant's going to have that like their counterpart in ODA doesn't have. It's just because they're different. Staff, they're younger there. Like there's just sort of different cultures that exist. And again, like so all of our guys kind of came. Not all of our, like they kind of came. There's no 18 X-ray program in the Raiders. So like every guy there has been in some conventional unit getting lifed out and like shat on for however many years before he shows up in an MSOT. And you don't always have that in SF. And it just, listen, I worked with some SF guys who were 18 X-rays who were like totally amazing, like, kids who were savants and really savvy. But like they didn't have that like deep knowledge of like, when they met up with the conventional guys being like, "Hey, I used to be just like you and I get it." So the cultures are different. But like I just bring that up because like you don't need to remind these guys that they're Marines. They know they're Marines and they're proud of it, but they can also be proud of this other thing too. It's like, get over your insecurities. Like trust me, these guys are going to thrive. They're going to make everybody proud.
For sure, yeah. And I feel like that might be part of it too, which is for as machismo and alpha male or alpha dominated culture we are, right? Like there's still some lingering insecurities within everybody, right? To prove themselves and everything else. So it's interesting.
I was talking with a very good friend of mine the other day. He and I we went to ARS together, and he old Second Force recon hand. He was a platoon commander during the invasion of Iraq at Second Force, and was one of the guys who was very instrumental in conceptualizing MARSOC. So he was like back in 2006 when they were really first building it, he was in the head shed doing that. And then he left the Marine Corps and went to CIA and has been over there for many, many years doing paramilitary stuff. And so we keep up, we run together in the mornings and, he's one of my best friends. But we were sort of, and he's a guy who's truly been like all over the place in special operations. And we were just sort of talking, and I guess as you get older, you see things a little bit more clearly. And he was sort of laughing. He was laughing at how old he was now, and how he sort of felt like he was like, wow, I'm like, he's leading one of these units now, and he's like, I can't believe I'm the old guy. We were sort of talking about like that kind of machismo and insecurity, and the Venn diagram that exists with special operators as they go through these units. Like, and now that I'm older, I'll say this: like, there is sort of this latent insecurity in all guys who go to special operations, in so much as you're always trying to prove the next thing. Like you're always trying to prove I can get into the next unit. I can get into the next unit. I don't know. Can I hack it? Well, I'm going to go see if I can hack it. So I'm taking the next selection. And you're sort of ascending this ladder. And like if you didn't have those questions about whether you could make it, you just sort of sit comfortably wherever you were. So I don't, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think like we don't talk about that people don't talk about that very much in these units. How like there is this sort of competitive insecurity. I don't know, am I going to be able to make it? Oh, I better go see.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think it's one of the unique things. It's a strength and a weakness, right? Depending upon how
Yeah,
you see it, right? Where it's like that same insecurity drives you to push harder and to never stop and never settle, right? And so, yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting. Yeah, that's awesome. And so, how many deployments did you do with MARSOC before you transitioned to your next role or your next job, or and did you leave the Marine Corps after that, or did you?
I did. So I did one. I did one. I just did the one deployment with MARSOC to Afghanistan, and I came back, and I went over to CIA, and I was a paramilitary officer there for a couple of years. And then then I was at about kind of the 8 year mark of doing this, and I had a great time when I was at the agency, um, and it was really sort of the analogy I kind of used, sort of how I was thinking about my life at the time was like when I was in the infantry, right? It was like, playing high school football. It's like love of the game. You're out there every Friday night. You're a scrappy unit, and and you're playing all the local teams. I feel like I went to MARSOC and Raiders, and it was like I was playing college ball. Like maybe I got nicer pads. Maybe like I got Nike sponsoring us now, and every now and again, like one of my games is on TV. Then I went to the agency, and I was like, now I'm playing in the NFL. I've got like I get flown into the theater on like a private plane. I got the slickest gear, and like we were going up against like the very toughest teams. But at the end of the day, you're playing football. It is the same game that you're playing, and it's great. But then I kind of got to a point after 8 years where I was just asking myself, is football the only thing I want to do for my life, for the rest of my life? And I loved playing the game, but I just like, there are other things I want to do aside from play football. And this is probably the time where I need to make a move if I'm going to have the opportunity to do those things. And so I made the decision to step away.
Wow, that's awesome. And so then after that, you transitioned to become an author, or what was the next thing you'd gotten into
So
after?
I had an opportunity to go work like at a political startup for a year. So I sort of
Oh,
pulled
cool.
out. I went and did that. Kind of had a whirlwind experience, like working in politics for a year. And then while I was working in politics, I knew this was kind of going to be a finite job, and I started applying to like a bunch of fellowships. And I was quietly writing on the side. I wasn't telling anybody. I wasn't telling anyone I was doing it because, frankly, when you don't have anything to show for it, saying I want to be a writer, it's like kind of like saying like oh I want to dance. Like it seems silly. Like I had nothing to show for this. So I'm just quietly working on a book on the side, and I applied for a bunch of fellowships. I got this White House fellowship, and I took that. And my family, they kind of joke, they'll call it my White House writing fellowship because I was like very much working on my first book. And then, long story short, over the course of that year, I was able to get my first book deal, and that was a circuitous route. Actually, the first book that I wrote got me a book agent, and then that book agent took that book out to like 26 publishers, and all 26 publishers rejected it. And then was working on a second book, and my second book wound up being my first book. And we took out that second book and we managed to sell it. And that was a whole year long process of success then failure then success.
Yeah,
So writing and making your way in the arts is a tough business.
sounds like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something that's like very uncommon, I think, for former Marines to do, right? Like I don't know any other Marines who'd gotten out and just become authors, except for maybe one who's doing terminal lance, right? Or I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know too many other ones, right? That's like that's impressive. And how like how did that feel? Like what was the feeling you had after you got rejected by 26 publishers? You've been working on this book for years, right? At that
Yeah.
point, pouring your soul into it and effort, and then like you know,
It was rough. It was rough. And I felt very fortunate because I knew there was this other thing that I wanted to do. So, right, I feel lucky, like, okay, my whole life from the age I was 17 until that moment, now I'm 31, has been the Marine Corps. But now I realize there's something I want to do that's not this. And so I felt lucky that I knew what that thing was, but then I failed. I had this big fail. And I'm like, what if I can't do that thing? And if I can't do that thing, then what am I going to do? So it was scary in that way. I didn't know if I was going to be able to make this work. So, um, but one of the great things about writing is that you are the master of your own fate. The only person who can stop you from writing and doing your work is you. And I think I knew that, and I just, and I was able to kind of keep at it. And to this day, I sort of, whenever I start a book project, I'll kind of in the back of my mind, I'll be, sitting there, all right, I'm going to get going. And I'll say, like, all right, well, listen, let's say this book project never comes together. Nobody likes it. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? I'll write a book and I'll send it out to all these publishers and every single one of them will reject it. Well, like, screw it. I've already been through that. So you can't do anything to me. I did that and I survived once. It's like, so in a certain way, like, it's actually, it was painful at the time. In retrospect, I'm actually glad I had that experience because to a certain degree, I feel like it kind of makes me a little bit bulletproof. Because I'm not in a position where like I've never had that experience, and so I'm scared of it, and I don't know what would happen if that occurred to me. So it's like the worst thing that could possibly happen sort of happened, and I'm okay.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it's an interesting way to frame it. And obviously, in hindsight, it's not you never know, can project what would happen, right? But I've seen probably people in both situations, right, where if you haven't experienced the failure or the rejection or anything else up front, right, and you're lucky to have success initially, that can be devastating, right, to hear or to have that fear of the unknown and to do that. And so in that instance, right, it takes bravery and and drive to continue pushing forward. But I think similarly, right, like after you've been knocked down, having this failure and rejection as well takes a similar level of drive and motivation to keep moving forward as well. So I don't know which one's better or worse, but it does sound like you've framed that in a way mentally to make that an asset, right, and say, okay, I took a step back. Let's see. Like, I send this book out to 26 people. They say no. Okay, what happens? I go back and do it again. Like, what? That's it, right? Like, there's no like public shame. There's no, maybe a delay in financial gain, right? But otherwise, it's not that big of a deal. And you survived it, right? And you've gone through the other side, and so now right? You have that as a strength and asset.
Well, I'll tell you this too. Like, I really believe that, like, like the poet Walt Whitman says, like we all contain multitudes. So, like, before I went into the Marine Corps, I was like in high school, I was like a dope smoking skater dude, like not what you would think would be a Marine. And it's funny, like the people since I've kind of like transitioned, and I have like a career as a writer and in the arts, and people sometimes say like, man, that's so weird that like you were a Marine and now you're a writer. Like I've never heard of that before. And it's actually the people who have known me the longest will say, we always thought it was weird you wound up in the Marines. We always thought you were kind of going to be more of an artist. So when I was in the Corps, I used to have this reoccurring dream. And I would be lying there. I'd probably have it like once every 6 weeks to 2 months. And in the dream, when I was in the Marines, I would be like out surfing or skateboarding again, and my hair would be long, and I would have like smoked a little bit of a joint or something, and I'd be like freaking out. Like in my dream, I'd be like, oh my God, like I've lost the edge, and I'm gonna like, get thrown out of the Marine Corps. And I'd wake up in a panic, and I'd like touch my hair, and I'd like still have my high rag or my, my haircut, and I'd be like, oh, okay, I'm still a Marine. I'm still holding on. I still got the edge. And I wake up and I would have that dream all the time. I got out of the Marine Corps and I kind of transitioned into what I'm doing now. And I have literally never had that dream since. Huh. Now, the dream that I have that has replaced that dream is I will have a dream probably every 6 weeks to 2 months. I'm back in like the basic school in like training area 60 doing the land nav course. And it's like 3 weeks before we get our MOSs. And I know if I don't find my box, I'm going to get like, ground supply or some like horrible MOS. I'm running through the woods and I'm like, man, am I still going to be able to like, get 10 out of 10 on the land nav course? And so if I'm psychoanalyzing myself, like, what this kind of these reoccurring dreams show to me is that at a certain point in my life, when I was in the Marines, like there were parts of who I was and my personality, like, they were just suppressed, not like in a bad way. It's just like I'm not engaging with this side of who I am and the work that I'm doing every day, and that's okay. And then I get out of the Marine Corps, and I am engaging with other sides of my personality, but like, I'm no longer engaging with the things I did in the Marine Corps. Like most of my days now are, like they're relatively solitary. I do my work, and I enjoy that, but I'm not like with squirrel and tea, and we're not like figuring out how to plan the next raid. And I do, like, I miss that aspect of it. So but I think that's okay. I think that's natural. Like, that's just life. You're gonna, my mother likes to say the secret of life is you can do everything you want. You just can't do it all at the same time.
It's wise. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's profound.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's been interesting because, like a lot of people have those stereotypes of, what Marines are or they're like or anything like that. And the reality, at least in what I've seen is right. It's probably the most diverse group of individuals ethnically, psychologically, life experience wise. It's all over the place, right? It's just
Yeah.
impressive.
And and the only real tragedy is like if someone takes that messaging and they believe it so much that they don't try to do some other thing that they want to do. If they're like, oh, I can't do that because this is who I am. I'm not that other person, so I'm not going to try. And maybe that's kind of why I tell that story. If there are folks listening who like have some other faster life they want to go in, like you should do it. You got to do it.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's one of the most powerful, lessons I think we've talked about today, right? Is like uh, all of the things that come together to make you more anxious or more scared or more nervous about taking a leap, right, into something new and something unknown. And so when you feel this passion or this desire to go do something, um, if it's not comfortable or normal or part of your day-to-day routine, right, then like you're gonna feel apprehensive and anxious. You're gonna start to see all the reasons of what if I fail, what if this, what about all of these things that then become barriers. But the tragedy, like you said, is if you just never try, right? And
Yeah.
that's like the worst thing I think you could have, right? The worst case scenario is 20, 30 years from now, you look back and you're like, I wish I would have tried that, right? Or I wish I would have taken that risk, right? Almost to, I, I don't know anybody who's said the opposite, right? Like, who's looking back on things and they're like, oh man, I should have never taken that risk, right? I should have never, gone for that thing I was passionate about, right? It's always been the opposite in my experience. And it's been interesting. So on that too, I was curious, what other types of like psychoanalysis or self-talk or like what did you consider when you were going through these transition periods? And in addition to just understanding, okay, like there's no physical or threats or associated with this failure, but were there other things like support from family or any other things that you had or that you considered before taking those risks and making bold career moves?
Well, I think the biggest one with writing was I was doing other work as I was writing, so I was sort of hedging my bets. Like I was kind of doing it on the side
Okay,
until it started to work.
gotcha.
So so that certainly helped. I think in some ways like the biggest challenge is how you see yourself. Like my same buddy who I went through ARS with, who I was talking about, who's been through every like special operations course. He likes to say, hey, he'll ask him like, hey, do you know what the biggest attrition event is at any selection? I'm like, what? He says the biggest attrition event for any selection is showing up. Like that's where you lose the most people because people won't show up. Because to show up, you immediately make yourself vulnerable to having washed out. Uh,
Wow.
and I think that is true in so much of life. Like if you just show up, um, you know, more often than not, you're going to pull it off. If you just keep showing up every day. And in the work I do as a writer, like I show up every day, like my work every day, like I do my work. And if I keep showing up, I'll have good days and I'll have bad days. But the only way I lose is if I stop showing up. Um, and that's sort of a lesson I really tried to take to heart.
For sure. Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, and I think the one thing that definitely you learn in the military, which I think is a lesson that a lot of people can benefit from too, is we're instilled with the bias for action, right? And so from day one, it's like if you don't know the right answer or you're not 100% certain, do something, right? Like
Yeah.
do anything, like show up, get to work, make yourself at like do anything, right? Take action. Um, and that's been really interesting to see, especially as I've left the military to ensure and even to check myself on, right? Because a lot of times now, I find myself looking back and it's like, overanalyzing things, waiting. So even this podcast, right? Like I'd been wanting to start this podcast for a while and just been finding excuses, putting it off, and then like, out of the blue is like, why am I putting it? What am I doing? Why am I waiting to talk about this? Like, I'm having a lot of fun doing this. Like, this is a great outlet, use of my time, right? Like, get to talk with amazing people. Like, what do I have to lose, right? And now we're here, so it's interesting. Yeah, and so I'm curious too. So, want to talk about 2034. So you've written a few books, right? So you're at 5 now, right? 5 published novels.
6, 5
6.
novels and a memoir.
Oh, got it. Okay, gotcha. So 6, and 2034 is the most recent one, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so 2034 is awesome for anybody listening. Highly recommend it. It's really interesting story if you're into any sort of anything with national security, military policy, but at the same time, one of the most interesting things I thought was when the lens that you told it through first person experiences and just story, right? And so it's not a history book, right? It's a novel, and it was awesome. I think I couldn't put it down. I read it in like a day, and started telling all my friends about it. Like, it was phenomenal. So and basically just to give a little bit about the book, it's projecting into the future what could be international conflict, what it could look like. But for me, it was also kind of rooted in a very realistic, grounded view of the world. For us as Americans, potentially in conflict with China and other countries like Iran, and how the geopolitics and things shape up to see what could happen. And so that was really, really interesting. I loved it, and it was awesome. So for that book in particular, what was your creative process like? Like, was it the same as all your other books, or how did you put that together, and like what was the inspiration?
One of the things that made that book different was I co-wrote it with Jim Stavridis, who's a retired admiral. So the book, originally the concept of the book, which is, a work of speculative fiction that would imagine what it looked like if the U.S. and China went to war in the novel's titular year, 2034. And that was sort of his idea, and he went to his editor at Penguin Press, who happens to be my editor. We just, through coincidence, share an editor. And kind of gave him the idea, and our editor said, like, I like this idea. There were books that were made like this in the Cold War, like a book called The Third World War by Sir General James Hackett, or even films like Dr. Strangelove that kind of imagine a Third World War. So Jim went to our shared editor with the idea, and our editor was like, this is great. Like, shouldn't you work with a novelist, and aren't you and Elliot friends? And he and I knew one another. He's a graduate of the Fletcher School at Tufts, and I'm also a graduate of the Fletcher School. He went on to be the dean. When he was the dean, he invited me to be the writer in residence for a semester. And so we've known each other for the better part of 10 years. And so we basically just sat down and said, okay, like, let's, we've never worked together before. Let's like try to write the first chapter, see how it goes. And so we sort of plotted out the first chapter of the book, kind of a really good kind of writing rhythm, the two of us. And it was a pleasure. We just sort of wrote the book chapter by chapter, creating these characters and, moving the plot forward. So, it was. I like to say for a book on a very grim subject, we had a lot of fun writing it.
Yeah. I can imagine. And did you find it was it easier or harder to co-write a book or co-author the book?
It's just different. It's more like you're coming up for air more. So, when you're writing a book on your own, you kind of like, you go deep underwater and you're kind of in this whole universe of the book all by yourself. Whereas co-writing with someone, it's like you kind of go under and you do the work and you come up and you kind of talk with one another and you tweaks, then you go under again for the next chapter. So just sort of a different process, but very, very enjoyable. And, most of my books, this is really kind of a thriller. So it's paced very quickly. So sort of just stylistically for me, that was a departure. Many of my other books are kind of more like internal and slower. And so this one, I like to think it's sort of, it moves quickly, short chapters, lots of action, colorful characters. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's phenomenal. It turned out good. So,
Thank you.
You guys did amazing work. And hopefully it also informs people as well to, pay more attention, right, and to understand potentially some of the things that are, happening in and around us. And so I think, especially over the past month, right, like with current events, we're at a cycle now where people are more aware and more emotional and more involved, whether they want to be or not. So on a world stage, just understanding our position and,
Sure.
foreign policy and agenda. And so I'm curious to know too, you do a few different things outside of just writing, but what's your long-term aims and goals, or, what do you, as far as the impact that you're looking to leave on the world and the country, right? Like what's your overarching, motivation or driving force?
I'm a writer, so I want to keep writing books that hopefully matter and contribute to people's understanding of events, their consciousness, and that's what fills me up and keeps me going. So yeah, that's really my goal. It's both very simple and very ambitious at the same time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you're still, I haven't checked your most recent work, but you're still doing journalism as well, and writing and weighing in on foreign policy and all these other sorts of things. And
Yeah, I do. So I write for a number of publications, opinion pieces, essays, and then I also write fiction as well. So I have a range of different projects going at any given time.
yeah, nice. Are you a multitasker, or you able to do that,
Uh,
or are you like,
I do. I generally will do one, major writing project at a time, but sometimes I'll stop and do smaller things like bits of journalism will pop up, and I'll have to take a day or two to work on something there. But book projects usually, I'm only doing one at a time. It's tough for me to try to have two going simultaneously because they occupy so much of your mind.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I found I'm terrible at multitasking. Like I'm not, you know, I can't, I can't do it. So I actually have a renewed affinity, especially after leaving the military for like deep work like that, right? And there's even a book I read called Deep Work, which, was talking about psychologically how to dive into, you know, more challenging and more taxing
Hmm.
pursuits, and how to set up your environment and handle those sorts of things. So it was interesting, but awesome.
No, that sounds good, man. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Cool. No, the pleasure's all mine. Yeah, it's awesome. And so, just so everybody listening can find you as well, what's the best way to learn more about your work or to find you? Obviously, you're on Amazon with your books and things, but your personal website and everything else, if you could share that would be cool.
ElliotAckerman.com. I've got a website, and I'm on Twitter at Elliot Ackerman and Instagram Elliot.Ackerman. So I think I'm relatively easy to find.
Yeah. Heck yeah. Well, excellent. Well, appreciate your time. This has been an episode of Forward with me, Derek Herrera. Amazing guest, Elliott Ackerman, who's a author, former Marine, former intelligence professional, White House fellow, amazing titles. He's also a father and husband, and it's been my pleasure to have him here on the show today. So thank you so much, Elliot. Really enjoyed our chat today and learning about your experience and some of the things we were able to talk about.
Me too. Thanks, Terry. Thanks for having me.